Alright, in this video, I want to talk about the Septuagint and the Dead Sea Scrolls. More of an introduction to get you to look into this stuff yourself. But I figured I needed to add this into my last video because there's going to be people who bring up the Septuagint and the Dead Sea Scrolls and use that to justify using the Old Testament Apocrypha or the Deuteronomical books, whatever you want to call them, to add them to the canon of Scripture as inspired, when it's obvious that they're not. They don't line up with the Torah. And if it doesn't line up with the Torah, it's because there's no light in it. It's not of God. God spoke to Moses, told Moses to write the Torah, and they meticulously copied that perfectly. And if they messed up in one part, they would trash the whole thing and start over. So, anyway, let's get into this. Here's an article that I used in a video that I put up on my channel, Jesus Gives You Balls. And it was about the Septuagint doesn't exist or isn't real, something like that. That's the name of the video. And here it is again. I want to put this in the info box if you want to check it out. But it's basically telling us about how the Septuagint doesn't exist in the way that we think it does, where people think that the Septuagint is a Greek translation of the Hebrew text from around 300 to 250 BC, around that time. And that's not true. The Hebrew priests, the Levites, their scribes, never did this. There's no record of them making this translation. Right? And that's what this actually gets into. The only evidence we have of the Septuagint before what's the dates? I think I'll get into it in the next article I bring over. Something like 200 AD. Oh yeah, here we go, right there. Origen's Hexapla, written around 200 AD. So that's where we end up getting the actual Septuagint, is from Origen. And he added things to the Masoretic text, my bad. And he changed things. He changed things so it lined up with the Greek New Testament, to make it look like Jesus and the apostles was quoting from what he wrote, but he wrote it in 200 AD, so it was after the New Testament was already written. The New Testament was completely written by 100 AD. So, looking more into this, you'll notice that this never actually happened. And the fact it says here is that the only Greek manuscript of the Old Testament before the time of Jesus that is found is 6 chapters of Deuteronomy. So that's the only bit of Greek Old Testament that we have before the time of Jesus. So this Septuagint thing didn't exist. All right. And we have letters from this guy here, Aristias, that talks about these Hebrews going, the Levites, and they're going to do some translations. But all the things that he says here is not accurate, like the names and the places and all this. So this shows that it's some kind of forgery, right? Some kind of false document to try to prove it. But what we see here, a summary, Septuagint from 250 BC is a supposed translation by the Jews of the Old Testament from Hebrew to Greek, but there is no evidence of this actually happening. The only evidence is this letter that was just brought up that is historically false. It has no actual evidence in it that prove that it's genuine. this Greek Septuagint from 250 BC is actually Origen's hexapla that was a supposed copy of the Septuagint, but it's not. It's his translation of the Hebrew, and then he acted as though he copied some ancient Greek manuscripts because he preferred Greek. He exalted the Greek above the Hebrew. There's other reasonings behind that as well, but that's just one of the reasonings. And if you feel like it, you can come through and read this in more detail and think about these things. It gets into quite a bit of information. So, yeah, check it out. This next one has to do with the Septuagint as well. Basically restates these things, but it has some interesting things here that I would like to bring up, and I think I would have to shrink this down a little bit to fit into the screen I made. So let me do that now. All right. So some of the points I would like to get into is right here. First point is the Hebrew text, which the LXX translators worked, was often divergent from the represented by the Masoretic text. But we need not assume that in cases of difference, the Greek is to be preferred. The LXX translators made some palpable mistakes. Their knowledge of Hebrew was often inadequate. They occasionally interpreted as well as translated, and they sometimes introduced local color. Right? And then it marks off some points here. The LXX does not follow the Hebrew tripartite division, but changes the order of the books to the categories of law, history, poetry, and prophecy. The chief uncle, my bad, got distracted there. The unical, or I just gonna have to excuse me, I can't speak. Written parchment on semi-capital style letter, which were used for the New Testament till about 800 AD, and of the which about 300 exist today, are A and B, both of Egyptian origin, and yet they vary considerably from each other. A is Codex Alexandrinus and B is Codex Vaticanus. Both contain most of the Old Testament and New Testament, and their Old Testament text is the LXX text. This is the manuscripts from Alexandria, Egypt, that doesn't match up, showing that this is not trustworthy stuff, such as the Gospels from Alexandria have 3,000 discrepancies among the copies. That's 3,000 contradictions among themselves. Yet people use this as, older manuscripts that are more trustworthy. We need to make a new translation. Get rid of the King James. Point 3 here says the original, I'm just going to say 70. The original 70 text of the book of Job was very much shorter than the Hebrew text. The translator left out large portions out. Point 4, in the books of Esther and Daniel, the 70 has numerous additions which are not found in the Hebrew text. Who authorized these additions? Point 5, the 70 frequently changes the order of the text, especially in Jeremiah chapters 25 through 51. That sounds just like Moffat's English translation, doesn't it? Point 6, the two chief 70 manuscripts of the book of Judges vary very much from each other. Which one is to be trusted? Point 7, there is no authentic 70 version available today anywhere. That is, if there was such a thing as an authentic 70 version, this 70 is referring to the Septuagint. Point 8, today's 70 actually has Theodosian's translation of the book of Daniel in it. Why did the original translation of the book of Daniel have to be dropped? Theodosian, a Hellenistic Jewish scholar, made his translation around 180 to 190 AD. That's weird. That's about 400 years after the 70 translation was supposedly made. Point 9. The 70 text of Jeremiah very clearly has two different authors. The first author translated chapters 1 through 28. The rest was done by a different person. The 70 text at point 10 here preserves several non-canonical books known as the apocryphal books. On what authority are such books included with the Word of God? These facts, which can be verified in the Britannica, again make the point that there is nothing inspired about the 70 translation, and that it is a poor quality rendition of the Hebrew Scriptures. And this is where I'll end up getting into the Dead Sea Scrolls. You see, people are awake to this, that you can't trust the Septuagint, right? Because the Masoretic text shows that, hey, this Greek translation is off, right? Since now we understand Hebrew a lot better. So they have to come out with these Dead Sea Scrolls having Hebrew translated, well, I shouldn't say translated, but with additions that line up with the Septuagint Greek translation. So it looks as though that the Septuagint is legitimate, as it copied from a different set of Hebrew, right? But I'll put this link here if you want to check it out with its detail as well. It gets a lot into Origen and what he did, where the actual Septuagint comes from. And yeah, you can check that out. But first things first, I wanted to look here at the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the first thing I wanted to point out here is it says written between 300 BC and 68 AD, right? Because they're saying that, okay, these things were written by that time because they had to be hidden away when the Romans ended up besieging Jerusalem and then eventually destroying it. So what a lot of people do is they'll say, oh, they were all written around that time, 300 BC, or they were all written around 68 AD. And the truth is that manuscripts would have been written all throughout that time. So just because you find, let's say, a copy of the book of Deuteronomy dating back to 300 BC, that does not mean that you're going to find the first and second book of Maccabees dated from that time. They might be dated closer to 68 AD, right? Each book would be different. It just happened to be that these collection of books were found in the area of the Dead Sea Scrolls here. Now, what I want to do here is actually take a look at some of these books that are in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the reason why I want to bring this up is because it shows that it's not something that you're going to count as trustworthy. Because there's a lot of books in here that are obviously not inspired, right? So, excuse me, we have some copies of Isaiah, Community Rule. I'm not sure how to pronounce that one there. Looks like Habakkuk, some War Scroll, Thanksgiving hymns. We have Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Judges, 2 Samuel, some parts of Isaiah, Ezekiel, Psalms, looks like Micah, Zephaniah, Psalms, Jubilees, Book of Noah. No one's going to say the Book of Noah is genuine. Genesis, Apocryphon, Testament of Levi, Book of Giants. This is supposed to be from Enoch. Apocryphal prophecies. Some of these things, it shows that it's written in Aramaic, different languages here. The Book of Mysteries, that rule of the congregation, rule of blessing, rule of benediction, Apocryphon of Moses, New Jerusalem. Just going through here because there's a bunch of interesting things here. Like the Book of Giants is the Book of Enoch in these places too. Looks like we got the Torah here, the first 5 books: Jeremiah, Psalms, Job, Ruth, Wisdom of Sirach, Ecclesiastes, Jubilees, Apocryphon of David, New Jerusalem, and the Book of Giants again. Ezekiel, Limitation. I'm just going to name the ones that are a little bit off because there's people who would use this to justify the Old Testament Apocrypha. And if it justifies the Old Testament Apocrypha, then it justifies such things as the Book of Giants and the Book of Enoch. And I think it even has the Book of Adam and Eve in here too. We got another copy of the Book of Giants. Just going through here. Well, suppose that is about it. I thought it had the first and second books of Adam and Eve, which obviously is apocryphal, but it does have a few different copies of Enoch and some other books here that people are not going to say are inspired. So you can't use this as a rule to say certain passages are inspired, and it actually leads you to think that this is just a copy of a bunch of stuff that wasn't actually considered inspired in the first place, right? So, yeah, uh, just because they have this here doesn't mean you go, oh, look, these manuscripts, they're older than the copies we got today. That means they are more accurate. That doesn't make any sense. I'll explain that here real quick. You see, let's say this book here, that's partially in the picture here. This is the original Textus Receptus, right? Now, people are using this. Let's just say this represents the the New Testament. People are using it and they're copying it and even translating it. So this is going to get used up. So what they do is they make a master copy, and then they make a complete copy that they save so that when this is ruined, they'll start using the other one. So this original copy is destroyed because it's been used and copied so much that it's just fallen apart. So they put that aside, even throw it away, and then they use it in the master copy. And the original copy might have lasted, I don't know, let's say decades, 30 years. Let's just say that. Now we got the next one. We would say that would also last 30 years. But they're making copies. That's why there's thousands of copies of the Textus Receptus, because they were copying this thing over and over. And then the originals would be used up, thrown out, and they would use the master copy and continue that process. And that's what would happen until they weren't able to do so for whatever reason. Now, if you have manuscripts that are copies of the original, that are, let's say, the originals were finished written by 100 AD. So let's just say that's where the original copies are from, 100 AD, just to make it simple. But all the copies that we have today are from 600 AD. Let's just say that's where they're from. But they're exact copies of the original. it doesn't matter, right? Because they're exact copies of the original. Just kind of like the Declaration of Independence. We have many copies of it, even though we're trying to preserve the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution and the Bill of Rights. You can get pamphlets that are exact copies of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights, and nobody's questioning whether or not those are exact copies, right? So you got these exact copies, but they were made in 600 AD from other copies, right? But if I copied the pamphlet of the United States Declaration of Independence, Constitution, and Bill of Rights, I'm copying the exact same thing. It's not, oh, this changed over the years. No, it's the same thing. So all of a sudden people dig up the Alexandrian text, right? And let's say these texts are from 150, 200 AD, right? And people are like, whoa, these are older than the manuscripts we have today. The closest ones we got to the originals is from 600 AD. These ones are from 150 or 200 AD. They are older. That means they are correct, right? They're more correct because they're closer to the originals. No, it doesn't. Because the reason why they're older is because people forged them, changed the originals, and then nobody used them. That's why there's not many copies of the Alexandrian text. There's not many. You have thousands of copies of the New Testament in Greek from the Textus Receptus, but you don't have that many with the Alexandrian text because people weren't using them and copying them. Right? And then when you go look at the Textus Receptus, you'll notice that there's very little, if any, discrepancies where they contradict because of some error in translating or copying. But when you come to the Alexandrian text, you'll notice that there is, in the Gospels alone, 3,000 discrepancies where they don't match up. And there's not many manuscripts. So that's a lot of discrepancies in a few manuscripts. When there's not many in the Textus Receptus, when there's thousands of them. And I think there's less than 100 of the manuscripts in the Alexandrian. So just because it was older doesn't mean that it's more accurate. What makes it accurate is if it's actually a copy of the original, right? So let's say we have the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. We have the originals. We make exact copies of them, right? But the pamphlet I have is made from 2011. So it's like about 250 years after these documents were originally made, right? But then somebody goes, hey, look, I found a copy of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights from 1830. And look, they're different. You'd be like, so? Those are not real. Those don't match the original. Not only because they don't match the original that we have preserved, but even if we didn't use the preserved ones, let's say we lost the original. I got a copy of the originals and a pamphlet right here. A little book from 2011. And that shows that those manuscripts you found are not right. Right? So if that same logic applies to these documents here, they apply to the scriptures. And I hope you're able to follow along with me there. So when you come across something like the Dead Sea Scrolls, it's the same concept. We have the Masoretic text, the original Hebrew. Why is that not going away? The original Hebrew Old Testament. And then all of a sudden you get the Dead Sea Scrolls and you're like, oh wow, look at this. This is older than the copies that we have. That means it's correct because it's older. No, it doesn't. Older does not necessarily mean closer to the original. It's closer to the original in its age, but not in its content, right? And just to illustrate it one more way, let's say I write a page about everything you need to know to be saved. I write it in a page of paper, right? In your standard notebook paper size, right? And I write that out, and people make copies of it, exact copies of it. Whether they use a printer or they hand copy it, they make thousands of copies of it. And this is 2023, so let's say in 2025 somebody makes a copy and they make changes to it. And they only make like 100 copies because people start looking at it and they go, no, you changed it. We're not listening to that. You obviously changed. We got the original. What are you doing? Who do you think you're going to fool? So they just dismiss it, and the person just puts it away somewhere, hides their copies of the fake letter that I wrote. They hide that copy, and then after, let's say, 100 years, what I wrote is gone, right? And a lot of the copies of my writing is gone too. Like, paper and ink, and people throwing them away and destroying them and mistreating them. But there's still copies of the copies of the copies of the copies that are exact copies, right? Because you can photocopy it, you can copy it by hand, you can do all these things to ensure the copies. So within 100 years, let's say the closest to the original is 20 years old, right? So it's the year 2123, and in 2103 is the oldest copies, right? And then somebody goes and they find this guy's house where he has his forgeries that are from around the same time I wrote the original, from 2023. They'll look and they'll, hey, these are from 2025. These must be more accurate because they're closer to the original. It's like, yeah, they're closer to the original in the time frame they were written, but in the context, the content of the letters, they're fake. They're adding and removing things as they see fit. So if you're going to use that just because it's older, that is not a good basis. Because basically what you're saying is that everybody decided to copy fake letters, and that nobody realized that they got a hold of the fake ones and they started copying the fake ones, and they copied so many of them that we have thousands of the copies of this original, but they're all wrong because these ones, that's the real ones that were hidden away in this other guy's house. For some reason, nobody was using them, and they were just in this trash bin at this guy's house who passed away 40 years ago. And they were, some of his grandchildren were looking through and found him. So you see how older manuscripts doesn't necessarily mean more accurate manuscripts. And with the evidence we see, such as using the Alexandrian text, there's a lot of errors where they don't agree. And with the Dead Sea Scrolls adding apocryphal books like Enoch, the Book of Giants. So why you would take this and think it's, oh, this is the truth because it's older. You're using faulty logic. In this sense, it's older because it was preserved because no one used it and nobody copied it. That's why there's no copies of it, right? You don't have thousands of copies of this because people weren't reading it and copying it and spreading it around. I mean, I can keep saying it over and over, but if you don't want to accept the truth, you're not going to accept it. So with that being said, thanks for watching. Take care.